Hi, welcome to our Dormouse Ecology and Conservation webinar, co-hosted by the Boom Project at the University of Cumbria and Yorkshire Dales National Park, with guest speaker from the People's Trust for Endangered Species. As the technology host, we managed to chop off the first few minutes of the Zoom recording, so I'm just retrospectively stitching on this little bit of introduction to the start. First of all, I'd like to introduce the speakers. Ian Court from Yorkshire Dales National Park, who will speak about their Dormouse reintroduction a few years ago. Ian White from the People's Trust for Endangered Species, who will tell us about Dormouse ecology and conservation. And from Boom, Back on a Map project at the University of Cumbria, we have Michelle Cooper and Dr. Deborah Brady, me, talking about what the Boom project is and our Dormouse reintroduction in the summer of 2021. The timings of the webinar are still relevant for this recording. So first of all, we have the two Northern Reintroduction projects talking, and then the main presentation on ecology, which originally had a tea break in, but this has been removed from this recording. And then half an hour of what was live questions from the audience. And now we'll jump straight into the main recording, where I'm just going through the practicalities of the live Zoom webinar. I hope you enjoy it, and do get in touch with us if you'd like to get involved or find out more.
And then when we get to the last half hour, the question answer session, we'll put the your video on, but your sound off still, so that the idea is we can see everybody's faces and there's a more communal feel to it when we have that discussion. So two more things. Ideally, as we go through the presentation, if you think of things that you'd like to know, you've got questions about things, if you could put those in the chat function as you go, and then during the presentations, I'll collate everything and then I'll share that to give the questions to either Ian or myself, whoever's relevant to answer them. So for people who aren't that familiar with Zoom, if you've got a full screen at the minute, if you just move your cursor down to the bottom, then you'll see that there's a chat icon. And if you click on that, then you'll get a box up, and you should just be able to send the questions to me as the host. So if you address the questions through that chat box to me, I'll put them together and then I'll present them on people's behalf to Ian and Ian at the end. If you are confused by any of that, you can message us during it as well, and we'll do our best to answer. The other thing which might be useful is whilst myself or Ian and Ian are talking, there's two things that you can do to pin our faces to the side of the screen whilst there's a presentation going on. If you move your cursor up to the top right, you can see that there's speaker view or gallery view. If you put it onto speaker view, then the person who's speaking at that time will be in a box at the side of the screen. And that's quite nice to be able to see the person's face at the same time as talking. The other thing you can do is hover over the person's face and right click and pin video, and that will pin that person who's talking to it. But you can fiddle on with that whilst it's going on. So I hope all of that makes sense. It is slightly odd that I can't say, does that make sense? and then get feedback. If there's a problem, talk to us through the chat box. Okay. So I'm going to talk for just 3 or 4 minutes about the project that I'm working on. And then Ian Court from Yorkshire Dales National Park is going to talk for a few minutes as well about their reintroduction project, and then the bulk of it will be Ian White from PTS talking. So the project that I'm working on and that's hosting this today is Boom, Back on Our Map, and that's at the University of Cumbria, and it's largely Heritage Lottery funded, and working with a range of partners, the main partners of which the Wildlife Trust, Morecambe Bay Partnership, Natural England and Forestry England. The project is a multi-species restoration project, so we've got 12 species that we're working on, and it's very much with communities. So the idea is to have community involvement in species reintroductions to achieve reintroductions within the South Cumbria area. The species list is a range of plants and animals and a couple of butterflies. Most of them, so the first 10 on that list, will be reintroductions, and the bottom two, the pine marten and the corncrake, are feasibility or social, working socially, sort of social memory projects. So there's a pine marten feasibility in the south of Cumbria. So quite a range of species on the project. So we've got 6 people working on the project, 4 officers, project manager, and a collaboration with Morecambe Bay Partnership. The origin of the project, which most of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, is the massive loss of both species numbers and species prevalence around the world. So the Living Planet report in 2018 showed a 60% loss since 1970 of numbers, so overall volume of biomass loss in that time period. So that report came out 2 years ago, so getting on for 2/3 of life on Earth lost in the last sort of 40 or so years. The latest Living Planet report actually came out the day before yesterday, so I hadn't included it on here, but the figure now has actually gone to 68% loss. So in 2018, 2 years ago, we were recording a 60% loss. In just 2 years, it's gone to 68% loss. So a horrendous situation, massive loss of biodiversity, massive loss of life on Earth, of animal and plant and other species. So that's the context which this project was within. And then when we look at it within the UK, we've got a similar story of 20% of birds being lost in the last 50 years. And when we look at predictions into the future, so Mammal Society a couple of years ago did a big review, and we're looking at 1 in 5 mammals facing extinction in the next decade. And when we place ourselves internationally, we also are abysmal. So of 218 countries, we come 189th. So we're very, in the context of the international situation, we're actually very poor in the UK. So very poor biodiversity, and that's what this project is, to try and start addressing that. The project itself is in the south of Cumbria, and there's a number of key sites, which you can see on this slide. The reason why it was focused on here originally is because in the last 10-20 years, there's been a lot of habitat improvement work in this area by a lot of organisations, and it was felt collectively over different organisations that the time was right to actually, the habitats had been improved and they were ready to receive species being put back into them, which wouldn't be able to get there themselves. So that's what this project is, putting those species back in. And the Dormouse element of it is into that area, Arnside and Silverdale. And we're looking at doing, releasing 90 Dormice over the next 2 years. And you can see on this map, the blue dot in the south of Cumbria for our project. And the other northerly reintroduction is in Yorkshire Dales National Park, which is the second blue dot on here. And that's what Ian White is going to talk about next. The project will involve lots of volunteering activities. I'm not going to read these out, but getting involved on site, preparing the site, working with the Dormouse, but also helping with events and consultation and so on. So there's lots of opportunity for involvement. So if you're new to the project and you'd like to be involved, the next slide will give some contact details. You can get in touch with us and let us know, that'd be fantastic. So there's some contact details generally for the project and for me as well at the bottom there. Okay, so that's me with the description of the project. I'm just going to come up. So next 5 minutes or so will be Ian talking from Yorkshire Dales National Park, and then we'll move on to Ian from PTS. So Ian, are you happy to move on to sharing?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll talk you through very briefly some of the Dormouse conservation work that we've been doing here in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and also summarise the Wensleydale Dormouse project, which is a 3-year project that we've just completed. If I can get the slides to move to the next one. that's better. So just to give everyone a background, this is the area of the Yorkshire Dales National Park that you can see here, including the recent boundary extensions that took place into Cumbria and part of Lancashire several years ago. And the area that's marked in red here that you can see is the core area for where our Dormouse project is, and where our 2 reintroduction sites currently are. So just to give you some background information really on the Dormice in the National Park. So we know from historical records they were present right up until the late 19th century. And we've even got records at Aysgarth at Freeholders Wood, which is where the reintroduction site was initially taken place in the Dales. So I think it's one of the very few sites in the country where we have historical records of Dormouse being present, where there has been a subsequent reintroduction. Populations declined over in line with population trends and declines elsewhere in the country, and became extinct in Yorkshire probably somewhere early in the early 1900s, perhaps a little bit later. As part of the species recovery programme that saw the reintroductions take place across the country, there were 2 reintroductions into sites in Yorkshire, Helmsley and Massam. You can see the dates here. And following that, there was a reintroduction into the Yorkshire Dales National Park at Freeholders Wood in the middle of Wensleydale in 2008. One of the things that's really helped us develop the Dormouse work and some of the issues with the Dormouse project in Wensleydale was the change in the national plan. So initially, when we did the first reintroduction in 2008, the strategy was to undertake a single reintroduction at a site. We then manage the woodland, hopefully the Dormice will increase and you'll have a sort of standalone single site. But that changed sometime after that, and then the idea was that you would look at doing supplementary reintroductions near to a reintroduction site to increase the population and make a larger meta-population. This real change in the policy enabled us to go ahead with a smaller supplementary reintroduction in 2017 at a site only a couple of miles away from Freeholders Wood. So one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that the Dormice expand out into the surrounding area. So we looked at developing, along with PTS, the Wensleydale Dormouse project. So as you can see from the wording here, what we were trying to do is create a network of hedgerows, small woodlands and larger woodland areas that were all managed for the benefit of Dormouse, that would allow them to expand and disperse from the main successful reintroduction site at Freeholders Wood. So that's really the work that the project's been involved with. It was a 3-year project that finished at the start of this financial year, and one of the main aims for the project was to get a project officer and also the capital work, funding for capital works as well. The National Park Authority involved in a lot of trees and woodlands work through our trees and woodlands team and our farm conservation team. But one of the real issues for us is when you're trying to look at creating continuous links. In the Yorkshire Dales, at least, you might have a linear woodland or an area where you want to plant a linear woodland that might have 3, 4, possibly 5 different landowners. So these things take a lot of time, and we just didn't have the staff resource to do them at the start of the project, hence the need for a project officer. And also, like I say, for the capital works. The main funding came from the PTS, and also the National Park Authority funded some of the capital works as well. We also got funding from the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust to plant areas of new hedgerow to bridge some of these gaps, and also utilised the countryside stewardship schemes that some of the farmers were in for the Woodland Creation Grant, and also if a landowner wasn't in the scheme, there was a possibility of using the Hedgerows and Boundaries Grant. We're also lucky that we got some funding off Woodland Trust, mainly in the form of trees, tree guards and stakes, which meant we could make savings on some of the fencing work that we did with the contractors. I think the main point about the funding and what was most useful was that the funding from PTS didn't have caveats on, so we could use that to match fund some of the more rigid scheme applications where you've got to do very fixed targets to get the funding. We're able to top those up with the funding available from PTS, so that was an extremely useful aspect of our scheme. So it really identified a number of different targets, all which were we set out to achieve. I'm just reporting briefly on these. So the initial aim was to do a hedgerow survey and assess the boundary features, so we could work out the best places to create connectivity and exactly where the new hedgerows and woodland management and hedgerow management needed to be done. So Phil Hibbs, who unfortunately can't join us today, was the project officer on secondment from the National Park Authority. So he surveyed over 43 kilometres of boundary features, including, as you can see, just over 12 kilometres of hedgerows. They were all done to the standardised Defra hedgerow survey. Unlike some areas of the country, we do have a lot of boundaries that are dry stone walls, so there are perhaps where there is small gaps and we've not got complete connectivity. Some of these dry stone walls will hopefully create a corridor that the dormice will be able to move on to. So it was important to assess all the boundary features within the project area. We exceeded the original target by a short amount by creating 2.9 kilometres of hedgerows into appropriate management. So I don't know what it's like elsewhere in the Cumbria area, but a lot of the hedgerows we have in the Dales, they're quite old, they're not managed, there might be gaps in them. So again, the idea was to create these continuous links. So we were gapping up various bits of hedgerows, perhaps underplanting with species, you know, primarily hazel to provide a food source for the dormice, and making sure that that connectivity was in place. We also had gaps, complete gaps, so we planted, with funding from the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust, 1.8 kilometres of new hedgerows. We also looked at bringing small woodland areas into favourable management. These are sort of large field corners where we could offer an area of suitable habitat for the dormice. So as they move along the hedgerows, they will hope to find these areas of primarily hazel woodland and small pockets. Service stations, I think somebody called them, so that they can actually help disperse into the wider area. We've also done a lot of raising awareness, including workshops, various talks and reports. As I think you might find in the sort of Cumbria area, dormice were a very new thing for a lot of people, especially farmers and landowners. They weren't aware of the issues, they weren't aware of what the management requirements are. So we've spent a lot of time over the course of the project, and will continue to do so in terms of raising that awareness about the conservation requirements of the dormice. So this is a very simplified map of our project area. You can see the connectivity that's been created. So the woodland blocks were already there, the larger blocks. Some of the hedgerows were or were in poor management, but hopefully this slide just visualises and shows how we now have complete connectivity from the reintroduction sites, which are the sites down here at Freeholders Wood and nearby near Carferby. And these woodlands here, further down the dale, are hazel woodlands where we've got a lot of potential for dormice. So hopefully you can see, like I say, we've got that complete connectivity now through hedgerows, and gives us a real foundation to work on for the future. So just to finalise really in terms of the legacy that this project's left is, as you've seen from the last slide, we've got a defined project area. The work that Phil's done and other staff members through the National Park Authority have looked at raising the awareness, so a lot of people and the landowners are now aware of what dormice require. So we will be building on this. So we've already had 3 or 4 farmers come forward who want to do more hedgerow planting. We were out with one earlier this week actually, who is keen to do some more hedgerows, plant up a few field corners with hazel. So we really hope that this will provide a framework and we can actually build, and hopefully in a number of years that slide that you've just seen will be a lot more hedgerows and woodland planting in that particular area. One of the issues we had when I first took over this project, that when I started, there was only one licence holder. So we had quite a strong training programme, again thanks to Ian White, who put a lot of time into helping us out with this. But we've now got 5 licence holders, and we can now make sure that we'll cover the area, and we'll be able to get all the monitoring done. And we've got a couple more in training as well. So we've been looking at monitoring the 2 reintroduction sites we've just completed, and we'll be publishing very soon a couple of reports on both the Freeholders and the Carferby reintroduction sites. So they've both done well. The population is stable there. So what we're working now is to try and looking at dispersal. So one of the things we're keen to do is hopefully monitor the dispersal of dormice from the reintroduction woods out into the wider landscape. We've got a really good baseline for the Hedgerow Survey, so if we can find funding in a number of years' time, that can be repeated, and will hopefully show how the condition and extent of hedgerows increase within the project area. We're also always looking at various opportunities to promote dormouse conservation work in the area. We had a really great one with one of the local schools. All the school kids did a project on the dormice and all did posters with drawings and photographs of the dormice. So, we've gone from 2008 having, prior to that we had no dormice at all, so now the local schools and all the farmers and landowners are aware of it. So again, we'll continue to develop this and continue to work with the landowners for a number of years to make sure that this hedgerow connectivity and woodland will hopefully be a lot wider, and all being well, our dormice population will spread into new areas. So like I said, it's a 3-year project. I've gone through it very quickly to give Ian the maximum amount of time. So again, just like to thank the funders, really. Without that, we wouldn't be able to have done the project. We are writing a project report up at the moment, so hopefully that will be available very soon, which we can circulate, and also, like I say, a couple of reports on the 2 dormouse reintroduction sites. So thank you for that. I shall hand back over to you now.
Thank you, Ian. So the Yorkshire project and Cumbria project, and they're both of them right at the northern edge of the dormouse distribution at the minute in the UK. At the minute, there's nothing further north, so both really important projects. Ian's is already established and has been established for years, and the Cumbria project just in the process of being developed and will be happening over the next couple of years with PTES. So the remainder of the time is going to be over to Ian, PTES, to go through ecology, conservation of dormouse. We're slightly over, but I think if we stick to tea break time, and I'll prompt you on that, Ian. Okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll do my
that's
best.
fab. So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks, Ian.
I'll just talk quickly. Right, I need to shave. Just lost my share bit. There it is.
I'll just remind people whilst Ian's finding that, do post your questions in the chat function, because I'll be pulling them all together, ready for the bit at the end. So to do them as you're thinking them.
Right. Right, is that working?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay. Right, okay, is that right? Everyone got that?
All good.
Good, yeah, jolly good. Okay, right, so my name is Ian White. I work for People's Trust for Endangered Species, and I have the privilege, I suppose, what I think is a privilege, of working on one of our most enigmatic native species, the Hazeldore Mouse. And I've been doing it I've been with PTS for 15 years, and I've probably been working on the species for about 20. And I remain the only person in the UK to have the honour of working on Hazeldore Mouse full time. So yeah, but what a great species to work on. First and foremost, from a dormouse point of view, what are dormice? Well, they're rodents. So if you ever happen to get bitten by a dormouse, they do have very sharp teeth like mice and rats, but they're not mice and rats. And I think one of the powers of dormice is, whilst they're occasionally referred to as mice, I think we shouldn't refer to them as mice, because people kind of get fairly negative connotations about mice. So dormice come under family Gliridae, as opposed to the mice and rats, which we're perhaps more a bit familiar with, which is family Muridae. So family Muridae are a fairly generalist species, quite a large family of over 700 species, which include wood mice, house mice, rats, and gerbils. They move in a variety of ways. They have a fairly broad diet, but perhaps most importantly, they breed frequently. They have quite large litters. So in essence, if you have conditions right for those species, they can produce lots and lots of young, which is why you can have a plague of rats or a plague of mice. And just to give you an indication of the breeding potential, if you have a pair of rats at the beginning of the year and they breed and they continue to breed throughout the season, and the breeding potential of all their offspring is fully achieved in terms of there's no deaths within the young animals. At the end of the year, you will have 1.5 million rats. The breeding potential is that great. Dormice are different. Dormice is a much smaller family, only 28 species of dormice globally. Generally have furred tails. They're generally arboreal, generally nocturnal. They're more specific in their dietary requirements. They lack a cecum, which is the cecum, the fermenting part of the gut that allows animals to digest cellulose. So dormice are inhibited in their ability to digest cellulose, so they need a higher quality diet. They breed only once or perhaps twice a year with an average litter size of 4, so their breeding potential is quite low. So this is a species whereby the young will stay with their mother for a longer period of time. So when the young actually go out and they become independent, they're well suited to their environment and they can pretty much look after themselves. They're also quite long-lived, so generally in the wild, dormice will live about 3 years, have been known to live up to 5 years, and in captivity they can live up to 7 years, so potentially quite a long-lived small rodent. And finally, of course, also dormice hibernate. We only have 2 terrestrial mammals that hibernate, which are the dormice and the hedgehog. So yeah, I don't like the thought of calling dormice mice. I really try and steer away from that because I think the concept of mice has quite negative connotations within members of the public, certainly. So we have 2 species of dormice in this country, the Hazeldore Mouse and Fat Dormouse. If we look across to Europe, there's actually 5 species in Europe. There's Hazeldore Mouse are quite widespread. Fat dormouse and garden dormouse are also fairly widespread throughout Europe and tend to head up into northern France. Forest dormouse is a more southerly European species, and the mouse-tailed dormouse is quite a rare species down in southern Turkey. Interesting, I think, in terms of although I say fat dormice are in this country, but they were introduced in 1905 by Lord Rothschild. But of course, because they're in northern France, had the channel remained a land mass during the last ice age, it's quite likely that fat dormice would have made it across to the UK, and they may well have been had the habitat niche of the grey squirrels occupy now, because as I said, they may well have made it across that land bridge. But it flooded before they could, so they remain as a native European species, or native continental European species, but not a native UK species. They are an interesting species though. They're about the size of a small squirrel. They were introduced to a woodland down near Tring, I say in 1905. And they're pretty much, I tend to think they're more of a high canopy species, tend to occupy beech woods, and their breeding is very much linked to years in which there's good beech mast years, because that's generally what they feed on. They can produce quite a high number of young, and they do hibernate for quite a long time. They're known in Germany as a seven sleeper because they can actually hibernate for 7 months. And there's one intriguing little bit of information that's come out recently which kind of suggests that there have been hibernating gliss that have been found with stashes of beech nuts, which suggests that they may remain under the ground and in some sort of semi-hibernation state for potentially up to 2 years, which again would be quite remarkable for a small rodent. I'm not going to say any more on gliss because this is really to talk about our native species and the one that we're really concerned about, the Hazeldore Mouse. So species is relatively small. The body length is about 50 millimeters with a tail length of around about 80% of that body length, and weight is between 18 to 20 grams in general. They're our only small mammal with a furry tail. So again, because we get a lot of reports coming in of people think they've seen a Hazeldore mouse, and we're keen to confirm that, one of the first questions we ask is, what did the tail look like? Have this quite sandy coloured coat that kind of develops as they go into adulthood. When they're younger animals, they tend to be much grayer in the fur. But again, that's the only thing that's similar to that potentially is a bank vole, which has quite a chestnutty coloured coat. They're also pretty much fully nocturnal. They're also pretty much fully arboreal. And as I said earlier, they are a species that hibernate as well. Very simply, from a Dormouse year point of view, so we're now in August. So we're basically coming into about the peak time which we'd expect to find litters in dormouse boxes, which meant that they're bred a month before, because the gestation period for dormice is about a month. So this is the peak time we would be expecting to find litters in boxes. Come October, they will be starting to feed up. The young will be starting to feed up, and young dormice can put on weight at quite a rate of knots. They can increase their weight by 1 gram a day, which for an animal weighing about 15 grams is quite a high percentage. So they can, so litters born this time of year potentially can reach a good weight for hibernation. Come October, they're starting to fatten up. The juveniles will be dispersing and the adults will be starting to fatten up to go into hibernation. And come November, early December, perhaps they will be heading down and going into hibernation. During the period of hibernation, they hibernate on the ground, whereas when they're active in the tree and shrub layer. So yeah, December, January, February, they're in hibernation on the ground. And they hibernate on the ground basically because the temperature is likely to be more stable, and also it's going to be damper and slightly wetter, and means that the animal's not going to desiccate while it's hibernating. But hibernation is not they don't go into hibernation and stay there for months. There will be periods of arousals, and as you move into spring, those periods of arousals become more and more frequent. By about April, about half the population is active, and come May, pretty much all the population is active. We very occasionally find litters born in May or June, and if those litters that are born that early on are likely to go on to have a second litter further on in the year. The key thing, so that in a nutshell is kind of what dormice do. As I say, the key thing to take from that is remembering that actually when they hibernate on the ground. When they're active in the tree and shrub canopy. So that in a nutshell of what dormice are and what dormice do and the dormouse year. And I suppose for any species you have to kind of question, is there a problem? Is this a species of conservation concern, and kind of what evidence do we have to show that is the case? We have quite good indication from a dormouse point of view of where dormice were in 1885, so over 100 years ago, because of a report written in the Zoologist, where the author pretty much wrote to his mates around the country and said, could you let me know the status of dormice in your county? And from that report, we've been able to build up the map that you see there, which fundamentally showed that, in essence, dormice were considered to be frequent in the southern counties. And then although they got slightly rarer as you headed further north, nonetheless, they were pretty much present in every county in England and Wales, with the exception of Norfolk and Northumberland. Although they've never been recorded in Norfolk, although that's not entirely true, Rope does actually record them in Norfolk, but he suspects that was a reintroduced population in Norfolk. The population was later identified in Northumberland, which was lost probably 5 or 6 years ago. But even in that 1885 report, there was also a suspicion that actually the population was not doing as well as perhaps it had been. So the upper text box there kind of suggests that that's from that 1885 report, which actually says that within this area of Northamptonshire, the species is not as abundant as it once was. That was supported by the paper below, which was written in 1945 and published in Country Life. This was a farmer's wife down in Hampshire who, in essence, before the war, she was going through the farm and going through the farm hedges and finding a lot of dormice nests. Then at the end of the war, she kind of felt she was finding much fewer. And while this is hardly quantitative, nonetheless, it's an indication that there is some sort of problem. So in 84, so the early 80s, pretty much the Rope survey was repeated by Elaine Hurrell, slightly differently in terms of she did the same in terms of asking her colleagues, but she then got all their responses recorded. So all the dots there are record sheets we have from her responses. So we're able to be a bit more quantitative on how we define whether dormice were present or rare or which kind of frequency class they came into. You'll see she picked up that population in Northumberland, and also she identified about 5 populations in Cumbria. But nonetheless, dormice in 100 years have pretty much been lost from most Midland and Northern counties. So there's an indication basically that dormouse range had contracted over 100 years, and also the dormouse population was in decline. So this prompted the Nature Conservancy Council in 1988 to ask the question, why are dormice rare? and as a consequence, that also caused what might we do about it. And one thing that greatly helped at that time is, as I've already said, dormice are both nocturnal and arboreal. They're also not particularly big, which actually makes them quite a hard species to study. We kind of forget this now because we kind of think that we use nest boxes, dormice use nest boxes, so that's absolutely fine. But before we had nest boxes, actually, if you came across a dormouse, it's almost by random. So it's quite a happy coincidence that about the time that Nature Conservancy was asking this question, the idea of the dormouse nest box had been thought up by a chap, Doug Woods, down in Somerset, and dormouse nest boxes were starting to be put up. And actually that actually meant that we could find where dormice were. You could actually find your study species. And to indicate dormouse presence, you don't need to have the animal in a box like is in the left-hand picture. A dormouse nests are quite distinctive, so actually if you have a distinctive dormouse nest, is actually that's evidence in itself that dormice are present within that area. So what, I said, Nature Conservancy Council asked the question, and that was picked up by two people, Pat Morris and Paul Bright at Royal Holloway, and they needed really, I suppose, to look at dormouse ecology, because we had very little understanding of that in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, how dormice use the habitat, what the population status was overall, was the Hurrell range map accurate? They wanted to have a look at that as well. And they did that by looking at the population studies using nest boxes, and that gave rise to the NDMP, the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme. They did quite a lot of radio tracking by, again, looking to answer how dormice use the habitats. And they looked at great nut hunts, which was considered a more quantitative method. So members of the public would ask to go out, look for hazelnuts that have been opened by small rodents and actually submit them as a way of identifying where dormice were. And that then kind of goes right to the NDD, the National Dormouse Database, which is the current database we use to manage one-off anecdotal records of dormice. So looking at population biology, they used, Pat Morris and Paul Bright used dormouse boxes. They put up 50 dormouse boxes at 5 sites, 4 in Somerset and 1 in Herefordshire. And they then monitored these over a period of 3 years to try and get an indication of dormouse population ecology. And kind of what did that show? Well, it showed that from a dormouse year point of view is that it showed a bit more information on the torpor and hibernation that dormice exhibit. So these are two different things. Hibernation is for a longer period that happens over winter. So it's considered kind of longer than 24 hours. And dormice hibernate because they're generally feeding in the tree and shrub layer, and as I say, on a higher quality food, not on cellulose. And come winter, that food is no longer available. So they could either cache food like mice and rats do, or they could basically store it in their bodies and then utilize it over winter, which is what hibernation is. Hibernation is not going to sleep. It's actually a kind of a profound physiological change where the body temperature drops virtually to ambient temperature. All body processes slow down, and actually that then allows them to survive and survive over winter. Ideally, to survive over winter, they need a good stable temperature. If it's a stable temperature and a stable environment, they will kind of remain in that state of hibernation for a longer period. When they start to wake up, or when they wake up from hibernation, obviously that requires energy, and they can't afford to do that too much. Torpor is a shorter bout of energy saving physiological change that is from a viewing point of view looks very similar. So you will find torpid dormice in dormice boxes. This is for a lesser period, though. This is perhaps only 24 hours or perhaps a few days, and it's usually due to inclement weather. So dormice will have woken up, they'll come out of hibernation. They'll be early on in the spring. There might be raining outside, or the weather might be bad, or there just might not be no food available at that time, or food suitable for them at that time, and they go into torpor in essence to save energy. So they're not using up energy, let's say looking for food or other activity. So when they hibernate within their active range. They don't move very far, so the range isn't particularly big, but they hibernate within their active range. They usually use a range of very local materials for a nest, and one of the thoughts of that is that obviously when you're hibernating, you're highly vulnerable. If you use local materials, your nest is going to be better hidden. When they hibernate, they give off no scent at all. In fact, we did run a project using a sniffer dog to try and identify and pick up dormouse in hibernation, and basically couldn't manage it at all. And dogs obviously have extremely sensitive noses, but they couldn't pick up dormouse hibernation nets. As I've already said, dormice do awake in hibernation, and one of the thoughts of why they do it is one is due to temperature, but the other is also to get rid of waste products, because they are still metabolizing when they're in hibernation, so they do need to get rid of those waste products. So it's quite, well, they do change nest locations over winter. If they wake up, come out of hibernation, they may well just build another nest and go back in. Overwinter mortality rate is actually quite high. It could be between 60 and 70% over winter, because again, just of dormouse running out of energy, not particularly because they're being predated, but it's actually likely to be that just because, say, they just run out of energy. Highest mortality is in the first winter, so young juveniles that simply haven't put on enough weight to survive. And also they get more vulnerable in the early spring when they're kind of getting towards the end of the hibernation period, because it's going to be, again, just kind of looking for food availability. And they do perhaps hibernate in areas that you wouldn't necessarily think. So, for example, this is a concrete barrier leading up to a trunk road, A road. That's the bridge that is over a trunk road. And the hibernation nest is where that glove is pointing. So they do seem to, you kind of think the dormice would want to hibernate in kind of quite secure and sheltered locations. But actually, there is some evidence that kind of suggests that the hibernation nests are often built in quite exposed places, and that's probably to make sure they can remain damp over winter. So there's another one on the top picture, just put in there, and that there's the dormouse hibernation nest actually found by one of the supporting posts for that crash barrier. So again, in quite an exposed position. So we mentioned torpor. So they enter torpor to save energy in the spring and can be in the autumn. Obviously, in peak breeding period, you tend not to find dormice in torpor. May or may not have a nest. This is not atypical. You may well open a box and find a torpid dormice in a box, but as I say, it's more likely when they've just come out of hibernation in kind of May, June, perhaps into early July. If they're disturbed, they take about 20 minutes to wake up. So I've already said dormice build summer nests, which are quite distinctive. They do build a range of nests. The green leaves and a woven structure underneath is a fairly classic breeding nest, but they'll build grassy nests, foliar nests, just out of leaves. Layered nests is kind of the classic nest, or also a mixed nest that can be a variety of materials. So a breeding nest is usually considered to be a densely woven structure, and it will be densely woven. The only other animal that builds something similar is a harvest mouse, and that's actually in a different habitat type. And also the key feature that you can tell the difference is a dormouse nest you will be able to lift out of vegetation, whereas a harvest mouse nest is actually built round the grass stems. So the woven nest is often built of honeysuckle strips, but it could be any local material. And they will often have more than one nest in an area they kind of move between. So I've already mentioned that you may get occasional first litters in May or June. Not that typical, I have to say, but it does happen. But litters are mostly recorded in August, September. We record 3 different young stages of pink, grey eyes closed and eyes open, and those are all considered to be young, unweaned stages when they're still reliant on the mother. And the average litter size for dormice is 4. They can vary, but that's certainly the average litter size is 4. And they usually, so the gestation period is about a month, and they're usually weaned after about a month, but they may stay with their mother for another month after that as well. And again, usually weaned at around about 10 grams, but anyone undertaking any dormouse monitoring you cannot age a dormouse by the weight. It's looking at the physical characteristics to age dormice, but that seems to be the age, the weight at which they seem to wean. One of the other slight curiosities of dormouse breeding is if you have a litter of 4 dormice, you might have 3 of them with one father and 1 of them with another, because they do exhibit multiple paternity, which is thought is a way of increasing the genetic diversity of a relatively sedentary animal. So it's a way of trying to get more genetic variation within the population. So those are some of the information they were getting out of the population studies from using the boxes. And the other thing they did was actually radio tracking dormice around the habitat. And whilst radio tracking is quite an easy thing to say, for dormice it's actually very difficult to do. It's actually often hard enough walking around a woodland at night, yet alone walking around a woodland at night with a large radio transmitter trying to find an animal that's is running around in the tree and shrub canopy, but nonetheless very important work. What they found from that was actually dormice occupy quite small ranges. So an adult male home range is about 0.6 of a hectare. An adult female range is much smaller, and that kind of means that an adult will generally overlap 2 or 3 females. But obviously the range size is fairly variable dependent on habitat quality. Also don't travel huge distances from a nest, so the ones that they were radio tracking, males travel about 70 meters, females a little bit less. And it's the dispersing juveniles that can actually travel quite a lot further as long as the habitat's suitable. So we have certainly got evidence of dispersing juveniles up to nearly 400 meters, and my suspicion is they'll probably disperse up to 800 or perhaps even a kilometre as long as the habitat is suitable. So you've got the males and females, when they settle into a range, seem relatively sedentary. It's the juveniles that disperse in the autumn, in September and certainly into October. So key thing really, they very much identified that dormice are very much adapted for an arboreal lifestyle. They have little sticky pads on their feet that help them to climb very well, quite sharp little claws that kind of help them climb up. And if a dormice escapes from a box, generally it will go up rather than coming down. Also made them quite good for pets, certainly in Victorian times, because actually if you could either keep them in your pocket, and if they were in torpor, they were fine. But if they came out of your pocket, they would tend to climb up on your shoulder or climb on your head. So made quite suitable pets. So yeah, I mean, very much adapted for an arboreal lifestyle. And they tend to use aerial pathways in both the tree and shrub canopy. 2 of the plants that are most important for that, one is hazel, and dormice are very often closely associated with Hazel Coppice. As hazel matures and grows up, it tends to grow over, and actually that creates quite a good connective link, a shrub canopy level really. Bramble's very similar in terms of it has this very well-connected area just much lower down. So hazel and bramble are certainly 2 very key species for dormice. So the radio tracking studies also showed that dormice were very reluctant to cross open ground, but the fact that actually it wasn't a complete barrier to them. If necessary, they would come to ground, but actually they certainly preferred not to. From a dietary point of view, as I already said, that dormice lack a cecum, which kind of makes them sequential feeders. So they feed on nectar and pollen seeds, but they need a range of plants to supply that throughout their active period. And that food diversity needs to be within the home range, which as I already said is fairly small. However, it's probably likely that dormice are probably quite flexible in the diet, and perhaps more flexible than we've appreciated in the past. And I think that actually probably the most important thing for them is actually the connectivity of both, certainly at the shrub level, to kind of enable them to get around the habitat and access different food sources. I've included that picture there, but there's a caveat at the bottom that dormice do not cache food. So that picture of a dormouse box full of hazelnuts is not evidence of dormice. It's actually wood mouse or yellow-necked mouse, because dormice do not cache food. So you come across that and think, oh, fantastic, this is dormouse. It most certainly is not. Give an indication of what that means from a dormouse point of view. This sort of range of food plants that dormice use. So the green bars are where these plants are flowering, and the right-hand side is when they're fruiting. So you can kind of see in May when they come out of hibernation, you have oak flowers, you have hawthorn flowers, sycamore, and then through into June, elder, dogwood, bramble starting to flower, and bramble has quite a long flowering and also fruiting season. We do have a bit of a gap in the middle, kind of between July and August, which is probably when dormice are heading up into the canopy to go and feed on an invertebrate diet. Then, of course, as you move into late August, September, into October, you then have all the mast food that dormice can feed on to actually build up the fat reserves for hibernation. So, having gone through all the kind of the basic dormouse ecology, just to kind of reinforce it, I suppose, I put these graphs together some years ago now. This is actually looking at 30 years of dormouse data. So this is actually looking at the weights of over 90,000 dormice by month. So it's actually showing, this is for the graph for December, and I said there that variable temperature can bring dormice out of hibernation. And we don't record dormice in winter because obviously they're hibernating, wouldn't expect to find any. But in December, a lot of sites will kind of go and look at go and clean their boxes out and will record dormice. So you can see there's a very low level of dormice, and these are animals that will come out of hibernation, gone into a box, perhaps tried to look for some food, found nothing there at all, and then will come back down again and go back into hibernation. That then continues into January. Again, you've got a few animals coming out of hibernation, and you can kind of see there's a group in there of between 8 and 10 grams that, to be honest, are probably not going to make it through because they simply haven't got the weight to survive through till April. It used to be said that dormice need to be a minimum of 15 grams to survive hibernation. I think 18 grams is probably more likely. And it's also said again that actually a high number of between 40 and 70% of dormice die in hibernation, but that's highly variable between years. Come February, again, you've got a little cluster of animals. Again, this is not animals particularly coming out of hibernation. This is animals awaking temporarily from hibernation, being recorded in boxes and then going back into hibernation again. And often around this time of year, if animals are recorded, they're often males. Males are often recorded at this time. Come March, you start to see a little bit more of a trend of animals coming out. But just the difficulty to survive in hibernation is that dormice lose about 30% of their body weight during hibernation. So that means if you have a 12-gram animal, which is just about the left-hand side of that March weight graph, is actually they need to have gone in. They need to have gone into 18 grams in autumn, which is why I think 18 grams is probably about the minimum. And to come out in 16 grams in spring, they need to go in at 23 grams. So again, need to be a minimum of 15 to 18 grams. I think it's probably more likely 18 grams to survive hibernation. Then come April, you've got more and more animals starting to become out of hibernation. A higher proportion of males recorded at this time to females. And obviously the key thing they need to do is to feed to restore body condition of weight they've lost during the winter months. So because we record dormice occasionally in May, that means they'll be breeding towards the end of April, but the animals that breed are likely to be the older and heavier females. And at this time, if we're looking for early litters, if we have persistent wet weather around this time, so persistent wet weather in spring, dormice aren't able to feed up, and hence that will impact and affect their body condition and then their ability to breed as well. Come May, all the population's active pretty much by May. You can see far left of that graph, that's the young animals being produced. Only 0.69% of litters are recorded in May, so a very low proportion, but I think they're quite important in such that those early litters, it's likely their mother can go on to breed, and also young of the year can probably go on to breed as well. Again, wet weather at this time can impact on dormice's ability both to feed and to breed, which can have, it kind of limits their breeding potential for that year as well. Show when the breeding events for dormice, so in May, as I've said, quite low, 0.69. In June, 5.11. So those May and June litters are only 6% of the litters, but I think litters born that early, mum can probably go on to breed again, and the young of the year can probably breed as well, which gives means you'll have some breeding years that are more successful than others. Peak breeding though or peak time litters are found is in September. And certainly one of the recommendations that has come out recently, if you're doing any woodland work, is actually September is the worst month to do it in because of the high likelihood of there being litters around. So come June, so all the population active, you've got a little bit more breeding coming on. There's other early litters kind of coming into the left-hand side of that graph. And again, impact weather, poor weather can again impact dormice feeding and breeding at this time. Come July, you've got the more breeding from the far left of the graph, and the adult population seems to drop a little bit, and that's probably animals moving away from going into boxes and heading up into the tree canopy, so not picking them up in boxes, because of that you've got that feeding or food shortage in terms of flowers and nectar at this time of year. That increases in August in terms of you start losing, say you're not finding as many animals again, probably because around in the canopy, but you can see again you've got breeding there's more and more breeding going on in August, and again as always the weather can impact on the seasonality or this pattern in this month in August. Come September, let's say primarily the most number of litters recorded in September. And some animals, you're starting to get some animals now kind of getting up to nearly 30 grams they're starting to put on weight to go into hibernation. Come autumn, most of the population weights tends to blend in together. You haven't got so much breeding, drops off, more and more animals are putting on weight to go into hibernation. The heaviest animal ever recorded was 44 grams, but that's very unusual. And I often hear that for a dormouse to go into hibernation, they can put weight on up to 30 grams, but even getting to 30 grams, you can see it's actually quite rare. We don't record that many dormice at 30 grams. Most tend to be around the kind of 18 to 20 mark. Then come November, you've lost most of the dormouse population, not lost them, they've just gone off into the hibernation. Hibernation has been a very difficult phase to study. And the key things really is what the keys or what the triggers for hibernation. And my suspicion would be is kind of a combination of weight, day length, temperature, and also body condition, how they kind of feel in terms of are they ready to go into hibernation or not. And they have hibernate, as I've said before, due to lack of food because it saves energy. So in terms of what it looks like, and like I said, so kind of in January, they're hibernating on the ground. Because they need fairly stable temperatures and also dampness so they don't desiccate. That runs through into February. Come March, you've started to get dormice awakening, so then a portion of the population is moving into the shrub layer. That increases into April, then into May and June. And the reason they occupy the shrub and the reason we can use our boxes to find them is because that's where the highest food density is pretty much in the shrub layer. They haven't got to travel that far find a high density of food, and also there's in a good shrub layer there's high density of nesting sites. As we move into July and August, some of the animals will move into the canopy because again they've probably got a higher density of food up there in form of invertebrates, less so in terms of flowers, and then they drop back again into the shrub canopy in autumn where you've got all the mastering and the fruits is available for them, but again at quite a high density. So from a habitat management point of view, two comments here, one from Harold, the other from Buchner. So habitat favoured by dormice is considered to be a thick secondary layer where bramble is the major component. And the one I do prefer is from Buchner, 2013, which actually says in all parts of its range, Hazeldore Mouse prefers the early successional stages of woody vegetation. So there's not actually a mention of Hazel Coppice at all, although of course Hazel Coppice is a form of early successional woody vegetation, but fundamentally dormice are a scrub species. Talk about Hazel Coppice, and the reason of the close association with Hazel Coppice is because dormice certainly use this, and it's a very good habitat for them because of that good connectivity, and because within a coppice mosaic there will be a variety of foods for them, but also it's because that's where we worked. So 100 years ago, or perhaps even more recently up to the Second World War, when you had farm labourers, they'd be working in the fields in summer, and come autumn they'd be coming in cutting the hazel for a crop. And of course when they were working over late autumn and winter, that's when dormice would be hibernating on the ground, so they would find they would find hibernating dormice it has been said that actually it shouldn't be called Hazeldore Mouse, it should be called Blackberry Dormouse, because they're perfectly happy in blackberry and use blackberry probably just as much, but of course we don't cut blackberry down in quite the same way. So there is this close association of Hazeldore Mouse with Hazel and Hazel Coppice specifically, but it's kind of our use for it as well as theirs. So in terms of what's happened to dormice, I'd say in essence they're a scrub species, and the two key habitats, I suppose, are really elements of woodland and elements of hedgerows. But this was a report from Plant Life that actually said that many of our woods are neglected or mismanaged, and actually pointed out that in 1947, so just after the war, 49% of our woodland was classed as coppice or scrub, ideal dormouse habitat, and 51% as high forest. By 2002, just about 20 years ago, high forest represented 97% of the broadleaf resource, and by implication that it kind of implies that actually there's only 3% was left as coppice or scrub. So we had a massive decline in the amount of suitable habitat for dormice. Dormice live also perfectly happily in hedgerows, and the hedgerows are very important both as a feature in their own right, but also as a connected corridor. These are lovely hedgerows down in Devon, where kind of they're almost not dissimilar from a kind of a linear woodland, but a dense scrubby linear woodland, and dormice very happily occupy these. But that's not the case over much of the country, and one of the comments from this book by John Wright is that hedges continue to decrease in quality, if not quantity. And I have to say this hedgerow that's not far from me in Hampshire is certainly not atypical of many hedgerows that were planted under various grant schemes. And you kind of look at that and think, would you actually call that a hedgerow? Because I don't think I would. It's been planted probably with grant money and then just started to be flailed. It's not a hedgerow that forms no sort of connective linkage at all for dormice or anything else. So we might be getting more hedgerows, but we certainly don't have good quality hedgerows. This looks a lot better. This is just off Golden Cap in Dorset, and this is kind of pretty ideal dormouse habitat in terms of you've got a mosaic of woodlands interconnected by hedgerows. I don't know whether there's dormice there. If the woods are managed to maintain that scrub layer, to maintain that level of succession woodland, they almost certainly would be. And again, if the hedgerows are managed sympathetically, so they're continuous, and they supply or can supply as kind of food resource for them, then dormouse will be within this landscape. So from an individual point of view, a good dormouse site has structural connectivity, so dormice can get around, and I think that's one of the key things to me for a dormouse point of view, because actually you need structural connectivity. They do not like coming to ground. They can if need be, but they do not like coming to ground. So that structural connectivity within the woodland is extremely important. You also need a variety of plant species for plant food, and well, plant species diversity will give you their food in their own right, but also have a broad range of invertebrates as well that they can feed on. And you need that within the dormouse range within the woodland. Then from a dispersal point of view, or good dormouse landscape, you have obvious good dormouse sites. You have arboreal site connectivity, which is kind of through the hedgerow linkages or through scrub banks. And again, needs to be within the dormouse dispersal range, which I've kind of said is up to a kilometre or so. So you need those good links to allow dormouse to disperse from the kind of the decent sites you've got. And one of the fly in the ointment is in terms of dormice, as I've kind of alluded to, are also impacted by weather. So overwinter survival is impacted by winter temperatures and rainfall. Wet springs and summers can impact on breeding, and dormice tend to be more abundant in years or in areas whereby we have cold local winters, so they can stay in hibernation, with warmer sunnier springs and autumn. So basically their breeding is not impacted. And that kind of concludes that dormouse populations are sensitive to climate change. Although there is a paper out recently that actually saying whilst that remains very true, is actually the key thing about helping dormice is actually to undertake and get habitat management correct. Is the habitat management seems more important or more significant than the climate. But still on climate though, there was a report that came out in 2019 that actually saying that yeah, under climate change, our climate is changing. So most recent decade, 2010, 2019, had less days of air frost, so the winters are kind of becoming warmer and perhaps more variable. We had new temperature records are set over winter, and also that actually UK summers are getting wetter than they have in the past. So our climate is changing. And I think that's also one of the factors of the reintroduction programme. Are they changing at different rates throughout the country? And actually, should we be looking to try and restore dormice to other areas of the country rather than just relying on the good population in the southern part of the country? Personally, I think we should, and that's why I think I and others certainly support, and continue to support the Dormouse reintroduction programme. So in terms of looking at Dormouse range, as I said, we did have the 2 surveys from Rope and later from Hurrell, but Morris and Bright wanted to kind of review that and say, well, was it accurate? And they used a nut hunt from members of the public, where the public could go out, look for nuts and actually submit them and say whether these are dormouse or not. And over the last sort of 15 years, we've also used dormouse nest tubes as a survey technique. And that's kind of shown that actually it's pretty much what Hurrell said, apart from we have lost that population in Northumberland. Cumbria looks pretty good, apart from the fact there's actually only 1 known population there now, not 5 as there were in 1984. But that's the current status of dormice in the UK now. Dormice are still considered to be frequent along the southern counties, but then quite rapidly the number of known populations diminishes as you go further north. And as I say, in Cumbria, we're down to the last native population. So, know the range from about the population. We have the NDMP, which fed off the back of that early work done by Pat Morris and Paul Bright of putting up dormouse boxes. We now have over 400 sites where volunteers go out and check boxes. I consider the NDMP a trained public survey. Because basically you need obviously a dormouse license to check boxes because you are disturbing dormice. But nonetheless, there's a lot of people going and do this work for us and submit the data to People's Trust for Endangered Species. And we have over 30 years of data, which is probably one of the most robust small mammal recording services in the world. But the results we get from that is not good. We produced a report in 2019 on the state of Britain's dormouse, which concluded that dormice numbers have fallen by 51% since the year 2000. So they basically in the last 100 years, they've been lost from 17 English counties, and the population's declined by over half in the last 20 years. And this is also underpinned by a report done by Cecily Goodwin, who was looked at the comparison or with the decline of the dormice over that sort of time frame. She was looking at under IUCN criteria, we should then be or could be considering dormice as being either vulnerable or endangered in the United Kingdom. And she concluded that actually the population was declining at a rate of 5.8% a year. And there comes a point where you kind of think it can't go on like that. If we want to maintain this species in the UK, we seriously have to do something about it, or change slightly what we're doing, or do more of what we're doing. So, kind of said that the factors affecting dormice: woodland management or lack of appropriate woodland management, habitat fragmentation in terms of hedgerows and woodland isolations, and also climate change. But there are other factors as well in terms of things like deer, squirrels, cats. Their populations have all increased, and while the likes of deer don't predate on dormice, what they do if you try and do any woodland work with high deer populations, it's actually they'll just come and eat all the vegetation. So they're actually damaging or not allowing that scrub layer that's so beneficial to dormice to develop. And if you kind of think of something like a fallow deer, for example, will eat about a pillowcase full of leaves a day. And I've seen woodlands where you've had herds of 200 fallow going through, which means there's not a huge amount of vegetation left. Things like squirrel and cat, both in the increase, they will both predate on dormice, but also squirrel obviously eats a food that the dormice relies on in terms of the hazelnut, and cat numbers will obviously predate dormice, and certainly in southern England you're getting more and more development alongside ancient woodlands where dormice tend to occur. Boar and badger numbers again also increasing, again whilst not obvious predators of dormice. If dormice are hibernating and boar or badger are out rummaging for food at that time of year, and they come across a hibernating dormice, it's quite a nice sort of protein snack for them. So I think, like so much of our wildlife, whilst there are key factors causing their decline, there's also kind of it's a bit death by 1,000 cuts as well. There are other factors as well that's negatively impacting on this species.
Ian, I was just about to give you a minute's warning, but that might be a good place to stop.
It's an excellent place to stop, actually.
Sounded like it.
Let's stop there. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Ian. Huge amounts of information, really, really interesting. I'm just going to remind everybody just before you nip off to tea break for 10 minutes. Questions, there's some questions coming through, so just a reminder of how we're managing that. If you move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you can see there's a little icon, like a little bubble that says chat. If you click on that and then type your question to me as host, I'll get them. I've been putting them all together as we're going. And then when we get to the end of Ian talking, we'll then open it up. But I will present the questions to Ian and Ian. So people don't have to speak on screen. I'll just be taking the questions and presenting them to Ian and Ian. And also don't worry about it. There's been huge amounts of information. So you might think, oh, that might already have been asked. But if you've got a question that you're thinking of, then probably other people are as well, and we can always elaborate on points. So don't think questions are silly. Do ask anything, and we'll have a chat at the end of it. Great. So 10 minutes, and then we'll all come back again. See you shortly.
Dormice are, and also looking at woodland management to maintain populations. So to survey, you have three choices. Well, you have 6 choices: nut hunts, nest tubes, nest boxes, natural nests, hair tubes, and footprint tunnels. I'm just going to briefly talk about those because, as Ian's already said, ideally you want to look as to when the population starts dispersing from the reintroduction site, and obviously these are ways you're able to do it. Nut hunts are a very cheap and easy way of doing it. I don't need a license, basically just looking for dormouse nibbled nuts, but you do require obviously a presence of hazel to do this, but a very good and very simple technique. Nest tubes can be used and have been used very successfully for a number of years, and there is a methodology whereby you can link in a survey effort with the likely absence of dormice. Obviously, if they turn up in the tubes, they're present, the likely absence is more significant. You can use nest boxes, which is part of what the NDMP is based on. Considered to be an expensive survey method, but PTS have made dormouse boxes with HMP Humber, which has pulled the price down significantly, and we've supported a large number of NDMP sites with prison manufactured boxes. Obviously, best used on vertical stems, i.e. hazel, and also at a height where they can be viewed and used for monitoring. And as I say, this is the basis of the NDMP, so not particularly a survey tool, but more a monitoring tool. One technique that has recently kind of started being used, and I must admit, I think this has got huge potential, is the use of footprint tunnels. Because if you put tunnels which are mostly made out of square drain pipe with an ink that's usually graphite and or charcoal and olive oil, and then obviously dormice walking on that, then onto inside the tube will leave footprints which are very distinctive and can show you've got dormice. They tend to have high detection rates when compared to conventional nest tubes. From a dormice point of view, it can take dormice about 4 hours to build a nest, whereas from a tunnel, a footprint tunnel, all I have to do is step into it and you likely got your evidence. So it can use a reduced survey period, and obviously, and also you don't need a survey to use this survey technique. So, again, there is a protocol whereby you can put a number of survey tubes up or tunnels up for a period of time, and you'll get a probability score of the likelihood of dormice being absent if you don't record any. So, yeah, I really favour footprint tunnels, I must admit. And also look for natural nests. There's no standardised methodology. It's pretty much going to walk in the length of hedgerow to find nests. Can certainly work, but we've never particularly used it as a survey method simply because there is no standardized technique. And hair tubes are often mentioned as well. So these are a bit of 22mm plastic piping with a kind of a hole cut in the top, sticky or sellotape or a sticky piece of adhesive put over that. Then any mammal running through that will leave hairs behind, and these can be checked under a microscope, and dormouse hair is pretty distinctive. But as soon as I start to think, as soon as you've got to make up pretty much, you'll get probably a small mammal running through pretty much all of your tubes, which means you've got to make up multiple microscope slides, and you've got to look at every one of them under a microscope, obviously. So I start to wonder how cheap it is as soon as you start to factor in the time element and the preparation element involved as well. So don't particularly use those two methods, but nonetheless they are still there. From a dormouse legislation point of view, you can use nut hunts, hair tubes, natural nests, footprint tunnels are all considered to be non-invasive, so no license is required to do any of those. If you start poking your finger in a natural nest, of course, that will be considered disturbance, so you would need a license to do that. But let's say nut hunts, footprint tunnels, hair tubes, no license required. If the presence of dormice is unknown, and that's not going to account if we just put a reintroduction site in, but if you're looking or surveying an area well beyond the reintroduction site, I think you can make a reasonable case. We don't think they come up this far, but we're just having a look. Until such time that you find the presence of dormice, I think that'd be a reasonable argument. But as soon as the presence of dormice is confirmed, then you would need to have a license. So if presence of dormice is unknown, nest tube, nest boxes can be checked without a license. But as soon as there's any indication that dormice are present, you need a license to check both nest tubes and nest boxes. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of surveys. There's various management guidance. As I say, dormice are highly protected, which means it's illegal to disturb dormice or their resting places. That obviously has implications if you undertake in woodland management, which is vital to maintain your dormouse population, because under the law, in essence, it says actually it's illegal to manage or disturb a woodland where dormice are present, yet if you don't disturb that woodland to manage it, then the dormice population is likely to become extinct. The way the UK has kind of managed that paradox is by advising that you follow best practice. And there's currently at least about three, in fact, these are the three best practice guidelines. One is the Managing Small Woodlands for Dormice by PTS. Other is a Dormouse Conservation Handbook, which that's from 2006, and there are two new Dormouse Conservation Handbooks due out. There's a Dormouse Conservation Handbook and a Dormouse Mitigation Handbook due out. The new Dormouse Conservation Handbook will be in spring of next year, and the Mitigation Handbook, I have to say, I'm not entirely sure when that's due. Draft copies have been written, but it's kind of stalled a bit with the statutory agencies. And there's also guidance from the Forestry Commission. That version, there is an old version, there is a newer version, which I think is available on the PTS website. So all those are considered best practice guidelines. So if you follow the guidance in there, you should not be prosecuted if you're undertaking woodland management. The guidance, our guidance certainly is trying to keep things as simple as possible. So it says for any coppicing work, you undertake it between November and March to avoid disturbing nesting dormice. And that's a fairly traditional time to do woodland work anyway, is in late autumn and winter months. Keep fireside paths and trackways to a minimum to avoid harming hibernating dormice. So basically, if you want to have a fireside, is perhaps in the past you might have had a number of these to limit the distance you had to drag brash. Under dormouse guidance, it suggests you don't do that. It's actually minimise the firesides because obviously you could be building your fire on top of hibernating dormice, and the more you have, the greater you increase that risk. And similarly with pathways, keep your trackways to a minimum through a woodland you're working in. Fellow coppice in small non-adjacent blocks, and again that's to try and create, or with the aim of creating a mosaic of woodland coppice coops at different ages, because there'll be different fruiting plants in different age of coppice coop, and if you're doing fairly small blocks, then obviously you increase the food availability to dormice. And also what you're trying to do is trying to ensure that actually you don't destroy a complete dormouse range, and you've got animals with nowhere left to go. Retain arboreal connection between habitats. If you've got a big woodland, that's likely to happen anyway, but it's still something to think about. So you could do that as we've done in this picture. You can see that dead hedge running up the middle of the of the coop there, and that's now become kind of a big bramble bank. That's caused a structure for bramble to grow over, which in essence has kind of made a dead hedge into a living hedge almost. And again, an ideal connective route for dormice. So we've also, I think there's 4 bullet points within the PTS guidance, but I would add another 2 now if we rewrote it, and that's certainly when you coppice to maintain stool density by layering or planting to increase your stool density. Every time you coppice, you are likely to kill some of the stools, so you need to maintain stool density by planting, so your coppice doesn't become too isolated. And also as part of the coppice work as well, you need to manage standards. If you don't manage your standards while you're coppicing, is pretty much your coppice will not recover and not come back anything to the degree which it would. And what you need is your coppice or your understory needs to be fairly dense and spreading and growing up, and it won't do that under a canopy. So you've got canopy interlinking for dormice to disperse around their range. And the other one, of course, which I've already kind of said, is in terms of the other thing you need to do is you need to manage deer populations, simply because if you do all this work and you're trying to create that structural understory, if you cut timber down or cut coppice down, is actually you've got high deer density, as they will come in and eat it all. And there are certain areas of Suffolk where, unless they deer fence their coppice areas, they won't be coppicing a woodland, they'll be converting a woodland into wood pasture, because actually all the stools will be killed by heavy deer browsing. So in a nutshell, that was kind of maintaining what we're doing with that. In terms of the enhance, that can be through new woodlands, through hedgerows, or also through arboreal bridgeways or arboreal bridges, and I'll just talk about those briefly as well. So this is actually Freeholders Wood. So this is a nice semi-ancient natural woodland in Aysgarth Falls that Ian's already talked about. So this is a quite a historic woodland that we've undertaken a dormouse reintroduction to. And if you walk out through that gate and into this woodland, this is what you get. This is St Joseph's Wood, that was planted in the year 2000 as a millennium wood. And this picture was probably taken a couple of years ago. But pretty much this looks to me like trees in a field. So even though it's been here for 20 odd years, it is kind of trees in a field. I think there were plans to try and improve this. It's quite hard to go to a landowner who has had a woodland planted at considerable expense and then go in and say, well, actually, we need to thin some of these trees out. Perhaps we need to see about planting some understory. Perhaps we need to see about how we might improve things here. Because there's quite a change and quite a transition from the woodland, the other side of that fence, which is Freeholders Wood, to this side of the fence, which is St Joseph's Wood. And it shows that I mean, there are big plans for government tree planting. There has been a lot of tree planting in the National Forest. But whilst it's one thing saying we want to plant a new wood, to actually plant a new woodland that is suitable for dormice is potentially quite tricky and needs quite a lot of thought to it. But it can be successful. I mean, this is a woodland that PTS own on the Isle of Wight. So this is Bridlesford Woods, a semi-ancient natural woodland. You can see old oak canopy there. You can see an understory of hazel that's kind of in, not quite in coppice rotation, but nonetheless it is coppiced, albeit for conservation coppice. And when we look at the numbers we record there, so you can see I've put down the figures from 2010 to 2017. I've shown the numbers we've recorded throughout the estate, and on the left in the first column, and then if we look at, we adjust those as that's the number of dormice per hectare, because we've got boxes over nearly 30 hectares, so we can obviously work out the number of dormice we record per hectare. We then can multiply that by 2, because it's thought that we record between a half and a third of dormice in boxes. So if multiplied by 2, that will give us an indication of the actual dormouse numbers per hectare. So we average about 1.73 in spring. And if we do the same through autumn, so we average about 4.93, so nearly 5 dormice in autumn. So that's the dormouse population density we're seeing per hectare in a woodland that's managed for dormice, but is a semi-ancient natural woodland. If we then look at another site on the Isle of Wight that's about 5 miles away from Bridlesford, this is Hazely Woods. This is about 5 miles away. This used to be agricultural field. This was planted up about 18 years ago. That's why there's not a huge amount of kind of ground flora here, but there's a huge diversity of species. You've got 53 species planted in nearly 8 hectares. So it's not a big site, but it's actually got quite a lot of dormice in it. If you look at the same figures, this has only been monitored since spring 2015. But again, look at the figures, and actually number of dormice in 2015, 39, 25 in 16 and 18 in 2017, which gives us a density of kind of an average of nearly 7 dormice per hectare in spring, as compared to 2 in a semi-ancient natural woodland. In autumn, we get nearly 16 dormice. So my suspicion is that actually those figures are slightly inflated, because I think because of the slightly different, or there being less natural nesting sites available in Hazely Wood, which is the newly planted woodland, I think we're probably getting a higher proportion of dormice using nest boxes. But nonetheless, it does kind of show you that from where you traditionally expect to find dormice in the semi-ancient natural woodland, the numbers you're recording in boxes of about 2 in spring and about 5 in autumn, compared to a considered newly planted wood of nearly 7 in spring and 16 in autumn is quite different. So very briefly, so new woodland planting can work, but it doesn't just need to be considered. In terms of hedgerows, something that again Ian talked about, he mentioned the Defra Hedgerow Survey that they'd used when they did the Wensleydale project. This is something that we looked at because we recognised that we needed a quantitative way of monitoring hedgerows. So this is something People's Trust for Endangered Species have taken over. We looked at the Defra survey, which is quite a detailed survey. Has a national data storage, but the biggest problem almost was your hedgerows either came out as favourable or unfavourable. There's nothing in between, and I suspect about 99.99% of hedges in the UK would have come out unfavourable under that survey methodology. There's also a simpler survey methodology called HEGS, Hedgerow Environmental Grading System. That was quite a simple survey as a single page of A4, but it did give a structural score, a connectivity score, a diversity score, rather than just favourable or unfavourable, and it had no database. So we also wanted to combine that with some work that HedgeLink had done, which is HedgeLink is the habitat action group for hedgerows, and they'd actually looked at 10 different type of hedgerows and then how you manage them appropriately to get them back into some sort of rotation and make them good hedgerows again, if you like. This was something we developed over this. The idea is to show that hedgerows are quite dynamic systems. So the circle in the centre of the dense and well managed is where you want to be. If you keep flailing a hedge on the same cut line, you'll move over to those hedgerows on the right hand side, where they'll start to become gappy. They'll start to have species invaded, and at some point you'll need to rejuvenate them either by replanting or coppicing or laying. If you go the other way and leave the hedgerow, head towards a line of trees, and again at some point you need to rejuvenate it. So it's trying to show that hedgerows are quite dynamic, and actually whatever manage you do, at some point you have to restore or have to do something with it. So we have, PTS have now taken over the Defra Hedgerow Survey, so we're now running the National Hedge Survey, but we do have a score of hedgerows, and we also have management outputs as well. So any hedgerows that are surveyed, there'll be management outputs of how to improve the hedgerows, obviously improve them in their own right, and also to improve for dormice and other species as well. And one other one on linkage is use of dormouse bridges. You may have seen some of these in the press in terms of this was I suppose originated quite some years ago, and it's often with developing in southern England where there are native dormouse populations, or there's a number of native dormouse populations, and the idea was if by putting a road through or putting housing development through areas of dormouse habitat are isolated from other areas, is they could then be linked with an artificial bridge. So a number of these have gone in. Perhaps the most high profile is the one in the bottom right. That was done for the Ryder Cup in South Wales. And there was actually 3 bridges that went up for £190,000, but certainly not a particularly cheap option. And you kind of look at the design of them and think, really, would Dormouse really cross one of those, in terms of they kind of climb up the pole and then have to work their way to get in that mesh tube, and then they've got another barrier in the middle. And they've never been shown to work. In fact, one of those ones for the Ryder Cup blew down a year or so ago, and it was decided not to put it back up again. So a lot of these things have been put in at huge cost, and not a single one has been shown to work. So we did some work on the Isle of Wight at our reserve, and we copied a design of a bridge that was used in Japan. And that bridge had been used a number of times by their arboreal mammals. It had been used, I think, about 800 times in 3 months. They had recordings of the species using it, including Hazeldore Mouse. So we built a prototype that we put up in our reserve. We tested it. We tested to see what was crossing on the ground, and we had dormice on this structure within 9 hours. So it actually came on very, very quickly. And my suspicion is because it's rather than having a metal mesh tube where there's just one access point, is you've got multiple access points onto this, quite an open structure. And dormice seem quite happy, as do squirrels. Squirrels use it quite happily as well. And there is a paper on this as well in Conservation Evidence that we published. And this is now picked up by the company we work with, Animex, and there's now a commercial version available, and there's at least 2 of these due to go over the M1 fairly shortly. There's one down in Wales, and there's about 5 or 6 in planning now. But at least we have a structure that we have proved or we demonstrate the concept actually works, and this is a design that we know works. So, and from a consultant point of view, it's much cheaper to go and buy something off the peg than design it from scratch yourself. Right, I was asked not really to talk much about reintroductions, but I couldn't really resist it. So I am just going to, because that was the final part in terms of the BAT was to reintroduce. So I am just going to talk very briefly on reintroductions, because it is a project that I must admit is very close to my heart. This was the comments on this slide is something I got back from a talk I went to at Zoological Society in London by Axel. I can never remember I can't remember how to pronounce his surname, but he's the chairman of the IUCN Committee on Reintroductions. And his thought or his consideration on species reintroduction is they are very difficult to do, which I'd absolutely agree with. Most fail, which also I'd agree with, and that's certainly, I wouldn't say most have failed within the Dormouse reintroductions, but certainly some have failed, and the question is looking at why. But he also thought they're very much worth doing, but they kind of should be considered as a tool in the conservation toolbox, not as kind of the answer to everything. It's not going to solve our conservation problem just by whacking a lot of species out there and hope some of them make it. It does something that needs to be very considered, but it's something certainly worth doing. And as a worth doing, I also added that other paper cutting in from there, because I always thought this was quite intriguing as well. This was from The Independent, I think in 2017. And this was at the end of, or around Christmas time. The papers generally will look back over the year and put their highlights in. So this one got put in the eye. And if you look at the top, it says, so on one hand, 7 planets around the same size as Earth have been discovered that could potentially harbour life. That's pretty exciting, so I can understand why that went in. But it's also rare Hazeldore mice were introduced into woodlands in Warwickshire in June. So they're ranking the discovery of 7 Earth-type planets with the re-establishment of a population in Warwickshire, which I thought was actually quite nice and kind of puts, yeah, to me, certainly put the reintroduction in context that, yeah, it is quite important actually in terms of what we're doing. But in terms of how we undertake reintroductions, as Axel said, it's difficult. What we need is a healthy dormouse population. That's actually fairly straightforward. We breed captive dormice. We can do that. We know we can do that. We need a willing group of volunteers to basically help us do the reintroduction and to monitor the population into the future. The tricky part is trying to find suitable woodlands to release them into, because you need a well-managed woodland or a woodland that's managed appropriately for dormice, both now and into the future. And that's the tricky part, is how to do that. And where we can get it right, as in Yorkshire, it can be very, very successful. But that's the tricky bit, finding the woodland or the woodlands and actually ensuring they are maintained in a suitable condition. As Ian said, already said, that the reintroduction strategy prior to 2015 was we did a release at a site, and then pretty much we hoped that that population would then spread out from that site and start to make its first tentative attempts to recolonise a county. Dormice don't disperse particularly quickly. There is a site which I was going to show, but I think I haven't got that much time. But in where there's the site was about 3/4 of a kilometre away from the motorway verge, and it took Dormouse 12 years to both occupy the woodland and travel the 3 kilometres down the hedgerow down to the motorway verge where they were recorded. So they do take a while to disperse. So I think the new strategy is much better, thinking much more locally. And the new strategy is this one, again, as Ian said, is you have 2 sites, you want to take 2 releases. At least we could do 3, and then you're anticipating the population's going to merge at a closer point in time and create a localized metapopulation. The first site we did with this approach was in Nottinghamshire in Treswell Wood, and Treswell Wood had actually been a site of a reintroduction in 2004, which had actually failed, but I think there's good reason it failed. It was the time that the local wildlife trust had recently bought the woodland, and the woodland was transitioning from, in essence, a canopy woodland to a coppice woodland. So perhaps not the best time to reintroduce dormice at a time when you're going to be doing an awful lot of woodland management work. But we'll see if this works. To show you kind of, this is not that long, it's about 4 minutes, but it's kind of really to me, really just show well how the dormouse kind of works. It sums up quite nicely in kind of 4 minutes, and also to show what a reintroduction looks like in terms of what it looks like on the day. So we'll see if this works. Do shout at me if it doesn't, because the last one we tried I don't think was brilliant, but not too bad.
Nocturnal, charming and rare, this is the common dormouse. A deceptive name, as they're anything but common.
The neglect of coppice woodlands and the destruction of hedgerows has meant these beautiful creatures are now decidedly scarce, and in some regions, almost extinct.
Coppicing produced wood for charcoal and fencing, but also created a unique habitat for dormice by reducing the canopy layer in a woodland and opening up the forest floor for plants to grow. As the demand for coppice woodlands declined, the practice died out, and so did the dormouse. But a reintroduction programme led by the People's Trust for Endangered Species plans to reverse this decline.
The Wood Show has come to a secret location in central England where we're going to follow the reintroduction of 36 dormice as they take their first tentative steps into the wild.
The whereabouts of their new habitat is kept under wraps so that the new arrivals can settle in undisturbed by humans. Deep in this coppice woodland, Ian White, coordinator of today's release, gives me a rare opportunity to see this animal up close.
There is no mistaking a dormouse, is there?
There isn't, no. They're only a small mammal with a nice furry tail. They've got this beautiful sandy coloured coat, nice big black eyes that kind of helps them see at night well, and these big long whiskers that allows them to feel their way around the habitat at night.
What's so good about this woodland for reintroduction?
A coppiced woodland like this is important because it actually gives them an opportunity to get around in the tree level, which is where they live, and also it does give that diversity of food plants for them.
So what are the key species for the dormouse?
Honeysuckle, which they can use for their nests, hazel, which they obviously use the nuts to fatten up in winter, blackberries, which is important because it's got a long flowering and fruiting season, and also oak because it actually has quite a lot of insects on it which they can use to feed in the summer.
Dormice get their name from dormire, meaning to sleep in Latin. Known for their long periods of hibernation, dormice can sleep for up to 6 months, or longer if the weather is cool. This species is also known as the Hazeldore Mouse, a name given by Victorian coppice workers who would often disturb hibernating dormice whilst cutting hazel. Each of these boxes contains not a sleeping dormouse, but a very lively one. They've travelled from breeding programmes across the UK for today's release.
Ian, we're surrounded by dormice. These dormice aren't going to be turned out into the big wide world on their own today, though, are they?
They're not, no. We've put some large cages up in the woodland. We did that a few weeks ago. We'll put 2 dormice, male and female, in each cage. They'll be fed and they'll be watered. And after 2 weeks, a small opening will be made in the cage, and they're then free to come and go as they like.
Each dormouse is uniquely identified by an electronic chip. Together with a Dormouse stud book, this information ensures that pairs are not related and stand the best chance of having healthy offspring. The Dormice being released right behind me came out of hibernation a couple of months ago. They were all importantly being health checked, and if the pairs are compatible, we might have a few babies later in the summer. The cage offers protection whilst the new residents acclimatised to their new home. But given the disturbance of their journey, it might be hours before they leave their nest box. Have you got a male or a female there?
It's the female here, and I think you've got the male.
Time to release them into their soft release pen.
Absolutely, so we'll just pop those two in there.
It's as easy as that. So what, Ian, is your measure of success as to the project?
Well, we come back and we check the boxes in September, so at that point we'll hope to record in lots of dormice and lots of young dormice as well that will show they've started to live in this wood.
But will we see the elusive little mammals before we leave? We've installed cameras into their release cages to capture the first moment the dormice leave their boxes. By dusk, it's pouring with rain, but luckily for us, it doesn't deter our first intrepid adventurer. We come back to take a closer look. Well, 18 cages have now been placed in the woodland, each with a dormouse couple inside. Let's hope this reintroduction project and others around the country ensure that this shy and adorable character returns to our woodland for good.
Right, so that was the Nottinghamshire release. We've since done 2 other releases there, and also then we've done a hedgerow survey in between the woodlands. And again, this is what fed into us PTS taking over the hedgerow survey. And that's kind of a plan of the area. So the first woodland we saw, that video one, was in Treswell Wood in the top right hand corner. And we've also done releases in Eaton Wood and Gamston Wood at the bottom. But all 3 woodlands are owned by the Wildlife Trust, that have also the landscape officers that kind of know all the landowners. The release has also helped form the creation of the Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group, which is very active in kind of doing quite a lot of the management work in between. So again, slightly different, similar aims to what Ian was talking about earlier, just coming at from a different angle. So this one, there hasn't been a project officer. There has been some input. I think PTS has bought some plants, but it has had the formation of a successful Dormouse Group that's very active with a good number of members. And a lot of local support. So again, we're trying to beef up the hedgerows in between to get to say those 3 populations to link at some point in the future. Right, finally then, I think I'm just about on time. I always like this one in terms of why are dormice good? Why should we worry about dormice? One, I hope I've shown that this is a species of conservation concern. Species or dormice have declined in both range and in population, and we need to address that. We don't have that bigger native fauna really, but I think dormice are one of our crown jewels. They're a highly enigmatic species. People do like to see dormice. Farmers do feel privileged to have them on their land. They are not a pest species. They do no harm at all. So actually they almost can be used as a driver to promote other conservation projects. And they're ideal key species as well. In terms of if you have dormice in the countryside and in the landscape, it's actually good for a broad range of other species as well, and also feels nice from our point of view as well. I think it's a native species, so I think we have a duty of care. I think we have a responsibility. I certainly wouldn't like to see dormice disappearing on my watch, but I think we do have a responsibility to our species. And the fact they're cute, well, we can use that to our advantage because everyone likes to see a dormice, and and farmers and landowners do generally like to have them on the land because it's a nice thing to have. And ultimately, what's good for dormice is good for many other species. I don't really feel we should be gardening for a single species, but if we garden for species that have a broad benefit to a range of other flora and fauna, that's not such a bad thing. It's an easier message to sell. Right, I think I'm just about on time, hopefully. So I hope that was of interest, and yeah, happy to answer any queries or questions.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Ian. That's fantastic. Loads and loads of information. Rather than us changing your mute and video settings. We thought it's probably going to be easier if you could do that yourselves. So the idea at this point would be if you could put your video on, but keep yourselves muted. And then when we're doing the questions in the next 30 minutes or so, people can see each other at least. But I've collated the questions and I'll ask them on your behalf. But you can still talk in the chat if you want to. If you'd rather not be on video because it is being recorded, that's fine, just leave the video off. But hopefully having a wall of faces for everybody will make it feel like you can see people who've been involved. That's fab, it's nice seeing people come on there. So we've got quite a number of questions. I'm not sure whether we'll get through them all, really good questions. I'll probably mostly run through them in order. So if I kind of misrepresent your question or miss a bit, do message me and I'll keep an eye on that. So Matt's saying that the host has turned off our video. Matt, have you managed to come on? Deborah's saying that as well. That's a bit odd because most people are managing to, so some people are and some aren't. Sorry to do this over here. Michelle, could you see whether you can switch on Matt, Carr,
Yep.
Jenny?
That's on now.
That's
Julia.
on. Julia, yeah.
Okay, I think there might just be a slight delay. So Matt, Carr, Deborah Clark, Jenny, Julia Sear, Kay Bond. Are you okay just working through people, Michelle, as we start? Yeah. Great. Okay, so two people asked about dry stone walls, and I think this was kind of triggered by Ian's Yorkshire presentation. So Mick asked, and they're very similar, is there evidence of Hazeldore Mouse using dry stone walls to disperse? And that was asked during your presentation, so you might have a thought on that. And then there was a later question from Deborah Clark, which was, with the Yorkshire Dales National Park full of dry stone walls, do you think they create a bit of a barrier, albeit with some holes available? Maybe it's between you?
Yeah, I think in terms of, there is evidence that other species will use dry stone walls. We do a lot of conservation work with red squirrels, which I appreciate are a much bigger or agile animal, but we've seen them move long distances between woodland. We've actually a number of times actually seen them do it, so we're hoping that that will actually assist dormice to move. We're not sort of expecting them to move huge distances, but we might have a short section, a single field boundary that might be dry stone wall with hedge either side. So if we can get the hedgerows up to a section of dry stone wall, and maybe they can see a close by section of hedgerow, they will then use the dry stone wall to cross. So we're not expecting them to use them on a regular basis, but we're hoping where there might be one or two small gaps or breakages in the connectivity, that they will use the dry stone walls more often than crossing open ground. Or the other alternative in the Dales at least is just a wire sheep fence that provides no cover or structure or anything else. I think one of the sort of exciting next phases will be to actually look at this. So we've got the boundary assessments that were done as part of the original survey. We know whether or not the dry stone wall or where the hedges are. So we're hoping, we've started a few of the footprint tunnels this back end of this season, but we're hoping to try and look at the dispersal. Hopefully we'll be able to answer some of these questions in the coming years.
Thank you. Thank you. Ian, do you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, just a couple of points really. One is this. I mean, this might show my ignorance of Yorkshire landscape, but in essence, I suspect dry stone walls have been there for quite a long time. And if you look in the 1885 report, there's quite a lot of information on dormice in the southern part of the country. But there's also quite a lot of information on dormice in Yorkshire. So certainly in 1885, they were seen to be fairly widespread as a species across Yorkshire. So I suspect they were using dry stone walls to disperse. And I have a vague recollection, I must admit no more than that, of seeing a paper somewhere that did look at dry stone walling. I have a vague thought that it might be Paul Bright, but I couldn't lay my hands on it, about dormice looking at dry stone walling as dormice, using them as connective corridors, and actually I don't think he really identified a great problem. And when you kind of think that going on to the work on the dormouse bridges, there's evidence that dormice will travel over 60 meters in a metal mesh tube. So if you're traveling through that sort of distance with no food availability at all, you kind of think, well, why wouldn't they use dry stone walls as a dispersal route? Obviously there will be a food issue. They're not going to be able to travel over them for a long, long way because they will need supply, but nonetheless, I don't see this should be a big issue.
Great, thank you. Linked to that, Ellie asked about dispersal, and she asked about whether they would disperse over fields, which then she kind of followed up with you'd kind of answered, but with sort of how do you know about dispersal? So how was that researched, and what could be done to improve it? So is there further research that needs to be done?
Okay, that's the multiple questions. Okay.
A dispersal question.
Okay, so can dormice disperse over fields? Well, there's some work done by Paul Bright, which is slightly shady, but what he did was actually took 6 dormice out in the middle of a field and in essence released them. And unsurprisingly, well, perhaps it was surprisingly, they didn't take the direct line route, the shortest route back to the hedgerow or the woodland. They actually went back to the place where they were either caught from. So it shows some sort of homing, but they crossed through the grass. They didn't seem to freak out in the grass. They basically moved through the grassland. But so that's slightly an odd experiment in terms of kind of why would you release dormice in the middle of a field. But there's also been a report from Buchner in Germany, and I've seen this site, of where they had dormice occupying quite small habitat areas of about 4 hectares. And these were isolated 4 hectares woodland, completely surrounded by agricultural fields. And there was population of dormice in the woodlands, and dormice were radio tracked dispersing over the fields. But 2 things came to that. One is, if you've got a dormice population in a 4 hectare wood and they breed as normal, well, potentially you're going to produce young every year that actually have no habitat to go into. So what else do they do? You're creating an environment where fundamentally it's almost, what choice have they got? They have to go somewhere. So what do? And when I started to question, well, actually, was it over bare earth or was there a crop in the field? Because that would make quite a difference. Sven couldn't actually remember, which, but I think that would also make a difference. In terms of where we've got data from at the moment, the data I showed you, that's generally come from chipping studies whereby you pick tags. So you use kind of the small transponder chips that you put in, or you may put in your pet dog or your pet cat. They're much smaller. We have got a few studies whereby dormice are pit tagged, and obviously then you can see where they've been tagged, and where they turn up will give you dispersal distances. In terms of is more research needed, I think there is an entire research project needed on dormice in hedgerows and dormice on roadsides, which are both potentially linear corridors. I don't think we know anything like enough about dormice in those habitats. And I think there's 2 big areas of study there, because actually both those habitats could be better than where we traditionally think of dormice in terms of semi-ancient natural woodland. Does that kind of answer everything?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Nice and thorough. Actually, I'm just going to say, just while I'm remembering, after this webinar, we'll send out a survey, monkey survey, just for feedback. We'll email it out to people if people are able to fill that in. That'd be really helpful. Okay, Crystal asked, let me just get it exactly right. What criteria are used to decide on the location of dormouse nest boxes?
Depends. I suppose it depends on what your question is. In terms of strictly for the NDMP, what we would like them up is to be in a grid. But you also have to separate the reality that this is in essence a public survey, and ultimately people want to go out and record dormice. So the value of the NDMP is the size of it. There's over 400 sites within it. So obviously there's a huge variation between sites. So on setting one up, the recommendation is you put dormouse boxes up in a grid space 15 to 20 meters apart. I doubt that's done that frequently. They might be in multiple grids, or they may be linear. So yeah, but we don't particularly have that much control over that, because it is in essence a trained public survey. But that would be ideal. But yeah, that's.
I think another thing in the Dales, you know, we are, at least at the secondary reintroduction site, was on a fairly steep slope. So whilst we looked to try and set them up as a standardised grid pattern, that, you know, some of it was scree, so it was quite tricky, and especially if it's wet, you know, quite dangerous. We have to bear that in mind if we've got volunteers checking the boxes. So the local topographical features also played an account, and also, you know, we've got some areas of really dense scrub and blackthorn that are very difficult to get through. So whilst you will look at using a standardised methodology, I'm sure that in every site there'll be different, you know, local issues. That means that you have to slightly adapt it to the local conditions.
Yeah, that practicality on the ground. Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to keep whizzing on because there's quite a few questions. Shannon and Tom asked about supplementary feeding. So their question was, could feeding dormice at key times of year help to increase hibernation survival or breeding success, such as what people do for red squirrels and other species?
Okay, well, a few thoughts on that, because one of the interesting things that's almost come out of lockdown, to be honest, is in the past we've had some records and photo evidence of dormice on bird feeders, but not that many. But over lockdown, we started getting a lot more, because it just kind of showed that people were obviously looking at their bird feeders at night, basically, or they had more fun putting cameras up in their gardens. So we started getting more records of dormice on bird feeders. So dormice clearly feed on bird feeds. In fact, again, at Freeholders Wood up at Ian's, is I remember doing a survey up there quite a few years ago now, and it was one year when the only evidence of breeding we had in the woodland was from a female that was occupying a nest box about 15 or 20 feet away from a bird feeder off the centre, the National Park Centre. Do you remember that, Ian?
Yeah, it was actually found in the feeder one day that went in slim enough to get in through the gap, but couldn't get out again. So, but the interesting thing about that site as well is, other than that year when we had very low dormouse numbers, we had a very poor wet spring. So we think that impacted on the dormice themselves and also the food availability. But that is one of the few years that we've actually had dormouse found on a regular basis through the survey season. You know, as Ian said, right in a feeder that was only, you know, 100 metres or so, less than that probably, from the actual bird feeding station. It's the only feeding station in the wood. So I think there is potentially a correlation there, yeah.
So that's one. The other one there has been a couple of sites that's actually used, sites that haven't had their nest boxes occupied. They've actually used hazelnuts. So they've gone around and put cob nuts within the boxes and uses that as a way of identifying whether dormice are still present, because have the cob nuts been opened and eaten by dormice. But the problem almost again comes down to feeding of dormice. How do you do it in a pragmatic way? Okay, it's fair enough having a bird feeder that's close to a centre, but if you want to feed in the middle of the woods, you could, how do you resupply it? How do you prevent it getting overrun by rats? And actually, how do you just get out to do it? Because if you put the bird feeder out in the middle of a woodland, it will be eaten by wood mice, by birds, by you name it, will have a go at it. Which means you've kind of got to go out pretty regularly to top it up, and you're potentially going to attract species that you really don't want to get in there. Mm-hmm. Just an email came in the other day that it was a chap. It was. Which I thought was interesting. I think feeding would be good. We do it to birds, and it's actually been quite successful. I don't see why not with dormice, but it's a question of trying to find a pragmatic and practical way to do it.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because they've got relatively small home ranges, and if you're putting them sort of the feeding outside of that, then you're potentially creating artificially increased movement within the within the habitat. Yeah, thank you. So question on invertebrates. So from Martin Baggett, and he asked, which species of invertebrate do dormouse eat, and how important is this source of energy to them?
I would say highly important. There's been one or two studies. There was a study done about the time of Elaine Hurrell, so in the 1980s, and there's been one more recently by Cecily Goodwin. And from certainly the Cecily paper came up with that it's basically it seems to be moth larva, so it's caterpillars basically they're eating. That seems to be the favoured invertebrate. But I've also heard in terms of there was an anecdotal report I had in of basically a lady sitting in a woodland watching dormice hang upside down on an oak leaf and basically pick off all the oak spangle galls underneath the leaf to get the wasp larva underneath them. So my suspicion is that actually that dormice are probably more flexible in the diet, and actually that there's so many gaps in their feeding from plant material is actually taken up by invertebrates. But my suspicion in terms of the predominantly, I think it's basically caterpillars.
Thank you. Okay, this is an interesting one about flooding from Sammy. And he says, or she actually, I don't know who Sammy is, due to wetter winters, do you now have to factor in seasonal flooding, possibly where the dormouse is hibernating? And can the woodland be managed to direct potential flooding to avoid prime hibernation areas? Do you want me to repeat that? Or?
No, got that. Okay. Okay, so the question probably is how the impact of flooding on dormice and what might we do about it. Up to now, we haven't done a great deal. If you kind of think, if you look back, I suppose there was 2 or 3 years ago, there were substantial floods in Somerset, for example, and dormice the population seemed to have survived quite happily through that. We know dormice populations occur in wet car, so again, a wet area. So A, is there a problem, is the first issue. And one thing that we're funding someone, Leo Goubet, down in Devon to look at dormouse hibernation. Dormice seem to hibernate in a range of areas, but one of the things that seems to crop up is they do seem to like hibernating on the side of banks. Now, whether that's due to increased drainage, don't know. The other thing in terms of woodland management is we've, I think, got quite lazy really in terms of woodland management, because at one time woodlands used to be ditched, and just like roadsides used to be ditched, and that used to manage a lot of our flooding. Well, actually, when was the last time anyone saw a woodland the ditches being cleared? So in essence, our woodland predominantly in this country have been working woodlands, but we've not been particularly managing them as working woodlands. So in many ways, is it a problem kind of our own creation? And actually, so if you do have a wood that's prone to flooding, he said, should you just say, well, actually, we'll just restore the ditch lines, and would that be a first course of action? Would that help? Might be an approach.
Interesting, thank you. The next question is probably to both of you, and it's about a disturbance question. So it's from Fiona, and she says, is there likely to be a problem with dogs when we introduce dormice? Dog walking has increased dramatically in the last few years and are often not on leads and rummaging in the undergrowth.
Based on the Dales, Freeholders Wood in the centre of the National Park is very popular with tourists. There's a network of public footpaths through it, which will, no doubt be used by locals, dog walkers who are perhaps in our experience less likely to put their dogs on leads because they know the area than visitors. So, we have thought about the disturbance side of it. We did actually look at a few years ago, looking at the occupancy of nest boxes within Freeholders Wood and where they were actually breeding. And bizarrely, if you actually just overlaid it simplistically, it looked like there was a strong association with them nesting right next to public footpaths, because they all ran parallel. But when you looked at the habitat condition, one of the management things we try and do within the wood is leave mature standing hazel around the footpaths to try and keep people on the footpaths and stop them entering the wood. So we found over the years that we were getting a lot of occupancy was high and breeding success was high at sites very close to footpaths. So based on based on one site, then we didn't consider it an issue. Obviously, trying to know about the hibernating dormouse is a completely different thing, but certainly in the summer and breeding season, then based on one site, it didn't appear to be a problem.
That's useful from a sort of practical aspect, isn't it? Thank you. Ian, did you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, I mean, went to a mini conference down in Devon a couple of years ago, and there was one chap stood up there, a talk there on basically they had a site where they had loads and lots of dog walkers going through, their dormouse population crashed. So it must be the dogs, of course, are causing this decline. And it's very easy to look at cause and effect and jump to conclusions. But having said that, you know, there's an awful lot of other public sites, and Ian's just kind of mentioned one that there doesn't seem to be such a close association. And I think it's very difficult, isn't it? Because I would suspect that actually potentially cats are a greater issue. But from our point of view, you have to kind of, you know, what would you do in an ideal world? Perhaps you might turn around and say, okay, well, let's ban all dogs and let's ban all cats. But actually, that's not going to work with members of the public. People, you know, love their pets and want to be able to walk them. And it's trying to get that balance. I mean, the indications are that actually, I mean, dormice nest quite happily by the side of motorway. I've certainly had dormice nesting by the side of lanes where people will walk. As I've already said, when dormice are hibernating, dogs smell, although it's incredibly sensitive, seems unable to detect hibernating dormice. They might dig them up because that's where they happen to be scratching, but a badger might dig them up as well. So it might be, you might say, well, it's one of those other factors, but I'm not sure we can do huge amounts about it. And I still think the thing we can do a lot about is getting the habitat right and getting the habitat suitable. And if we do that, and we make sure the populations are robust enough that they can kind of manage these kind of more minor, less major disturbances rather than minor disturbances, that's probably the best and most practical way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Ty has just come back on about the question and discussion about flooding and managing ditches, and has made the good point that care is needed here as woodlands can make a positive contribution to natural flood management, so may not want to open up ditches or create new ones. So that balance. I don't know if you want to add anything, Ian? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much on the topic of flood management. I would have thought if you're looking at flood management of woodland holding water, so it's kind of almost trying to manage it where you want it to be rather than where you don't. So yeah, I say it's not a field I work know particularly well. So I'd be, yeah, so I like all things, I suppose it's on that sort of area, it would be very site specific.
I think in the uplands there's a lot more focus on the flood prevention, you know, on the fell sides to actually stop the slow the flow down the valleys and dales and things like that. So that might be where you would optimise a woodland for flood retention, whereas, you know, some of the areas you perhaps might have a more of a focus on the dormice. So I think it's about knowing or trying to have a clear objective of what you want for the woodland. So if you were putting in a woodland solely for flood prevention, then you accept that it might not be an ideal site for dormice, and, you know, and vice versa as well. So I think it's about identifying the objectives of your woodland management, really.
Yeah.
And it also kind of does come back as well to kind of the whole, if you can get the habitat right, if you have a poor year and the dormouse are negatively impacted, as long as sufficient of the population survives to keep the population going, well, that's okay, isn't it? You're not continue looking to build your population as long as you can maintain the population over time.
Thank you. Possibly time for one more question. Anecdotal accounts and evidence have been mentioned a couple of times. You're hanging off a leaf eating things, and also earlier in the presentation about the farmer's wife recording and commenting. So the question from Michelle is around how important is anecdotal evidence, given that it's such a secretive creature. Does PTS regularly get sent anecdotal evidence? Is it recorded, and is it actively sought?
Okay, well, things like you mentioned the country file, I mean, the country life report as anecdotal evidence. I mean, but that's, I suppose, not particularly anecdotal in terms of it's only anecdotal and it's her report. There's no data to back it up, but nonetheless, it has been a published paper. It's written, it's down in writing that that's a person's view. But I suppose, Is it all reported? No, I mean, the reason I refer to, I suppose, anecdotal evidence is because I've been working in the field for quite a long time, is I do get told stories, you do get told tales, and you build up a picture of how you see things. But so from my point of view, it's a value because it gives a greater understanding of the species. And I always think it's nice to be able to personalize it as well when you're talking to other people. I think there's a value in that. But as an organization, we would want evidence. So we run the NDMP, obviously we also run the NDD, and we run all the license return data. So anything that comes through on the NDD that people say, well, actually, I've recorded a dormouse, we will want a photograph, we will want something positive to prove the presence of that species. If it's an important fact and we can get corroborated evidence, we will do so, or we'll encourage the writing of a paper that we can do. And similarly with the license return data. So license return data is people that have a dormouse license are required under Nature England to submit the data to PTS. If we get records coming in from consultants that we're not happy with for whatever reason, we will contact that consultant and ask for evidence of their record. So I think from pure anecdotal data or stories I hear, I wouldn't necessarily report them as such, but it builds up a picture to me. For data, we look definitely to corroborate and actually make sure it's as accurate as possible. And I think in current climate, I think that's vital. I think, you can't try and develop a policy or a plan of saying, well, I think this is the case. We think dormice are declining by 25%. And when a politician or a grant giver says, what's your evidence? So, well, we haven't really got anything, but that's what we think it is. You can't do that. You have to have facts and figures, and it has to be very real.
Great, thank you. I will add on the Boom project, we have got a strong social side to it. So we are particularly interested in that side of anecdotal evidence or sort of social memories or history. And we have got a volunteer already who's working on researching the background of dormouse in the project area and looking at the history of coppicing and where the products went and how the populations changed. So, so yeah, if you do have something to contribute on that side, that would be fantastic. We've got 3 minutes left and there's something that's come back on the dog. So I'm going to add that. There were a few more questions, which we're not going to come to, but I've left them till last because I know the people. So I will personally get back, and so nobody will be actually missed out on questions. So the dog one is from Matt Carr, and it's come back on the dog one. Is there a list of key messages that you want to get out to the local population for displays, etc.? And this could encourage responsible pet management. So sort of interpretation around disturbance.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that the National Park Authority do on a sort of daily basis. So we encourage responsible use of the countryside. So whether that's in a wood, on the fells, walking through fields, we do encourage. There's signage, there's interpretation, there's things at our visitor centres all about responsible use and keeping dogs on a lead. I think things, to bear in mind that on a public right of way, you're not legally required to have your dog on a lead. It has to be under close control, and there is a legal definition of that. So again, some of the wording needs to be carefully thought about. But yeah, it's a problem or an issue right across the park in all types of habitat about dog walkers. You will have responsible dog owners who will, put the dog on the lead, keep it under close control, and ones that aren't. So it is you can put as much signage up as you want, but it's it is going to always be a problem in some areas and at some sites. It's we often see them. Yeah. People will see you in a national park logoed gear. They'll bend down, put the dog on the lead, walk past you, and then 50 yards when they're past you, they'll let it off again. So it's it is an issue, and we do promote responsible dog walking and whatnot, but it is an issue.
Thank you. Ian, did you want to add anything on?
Only say really, because we're a kind of a national organisation, it's not something we feel it'd be worthwhile us putting out nationally unless a site owner came to us and said, what would we suggest? I think it's kind of a very site-specific thing, and that's going to have more impact on dog walkers rather than us as purely from a dormouse point of view coming out and saying, oh, we think dog walkers should do this. I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think it's quite a site-specific issue, really. Yeah, that would be my view.
We've run out of time. So I'm gonna say thank yous. Really interesting, huge amounts of information. We had half an hour for questions, but I think we could have gone on longer. I will get back to the few people that haven't had their questions answered. And if people do have other questions, you've got the contact details, so you can get back to us, and I can forward on to Yorkshire or PTS as appropriate. We've had about 35 people throughout the afternoon on a Friday afternoon, so I think that's a really good turnout. Really pleased about that. So I'm really grateful for everybody giving up their time and coming along, and I really hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful, and please do get in touch if you want to know any more about any of the projects or about any of it. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye from us. Do you want to say goodbye, Ian?
Yeah, hope that was all interesting, and hopefully we'll meet some of you next year now when we can actually do the reintroduction for real.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Cheers, bye.